The judge did not hand me victory that afternoon. He simply reminded everyone who had owned the road all along. The first sound that reached my porch the morning after the trial was not birds singing over the pasture. It was a wall of impatient car horns rolling across 1,600 acres of Texas ranch land before the sun had fully climbed above the cedar trees. I wrapped both hands around a mug of black coffee and stepped onto the weathered wooden porch just as the cool morning breeze carried the familiar smell of damp earth, fresh hay, and cedar across the property. Half a mile away, a line of luxury sport utility vehicles stretched from my front gate all the way to the county highway. Engines idled. Drivers stepped onto the pavement with confused expressions. Some shaded their eyes toward the entrance while others pointed at the massive black steel gate standing firmly across the only paved road leading into Stone Creek Estates. They looked as though the gate had appeared overnight, but it had been there for years. It simply had not been closed. Standing closest to the entrance was Margaret Collins, president of the Homeowners Association, still wearing the same navy blazer she had worn inside the courthouse the previous afternoon. Even from that distance, I recognized the determined way she walked, shoulders straight, one hand gripping a thick folder of legal papers while the other pointed toward the deputy standing calmly beside his patrol vehicle. Blue emergency lights flashed softly against the polished steel gate without a single siren breaking the quiet morning. I could not hear every word they exchanged, but the wind carried enough across the valley for me to understand exactly what was happening. The deputy glanced at the certified court order in his hand before looking back at Margaret with the patient expression of a man repeating something for the 10th time. "Ma'am, the ruling is final. This entrance is private property." The conversations behind her stopped almost instantly. Homeowners who had left for work expecting an ordinary Tuesday morning suddenly realized nobody was moving anywhere. Some stared at the sign bolted neatly beside the entrance. Private road. Authorized access only. Others turned around searching for another way into the neighborhood that simply did not exist. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before dozens of voices rose together in confusion. It was remarkable how quickly certainty disappeared once paperwork caught up with assumptions. The strange part was that nothing had actually changed overnight. The road had not been sold. The county had not abandoned it. No fences had been moved. No survey lines had shifted. Every inch of pavement beneath those expensive tires belonged to my family exactly as it had for decades. The only thing that changed was that a judge finally confirmed what faded property records had been saying all along. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 39 years old, a third-generation Texas ranch owner, and every fence post, cattle trail, creek crossing, and acre across this ranch carries a story my grandfather left behind. Most people believe land disputes begin with greed. Mine began because too many people confused daily use with legal ownership. They believed that if enough neighbors drove across the same road long enough, the road somehow stopped belonging to the family that built it. They were about to learn that Texas soil remembers every signature ever placed on a deed, even when people forget. I grew up believing that land does not belong to the person whose name appears on the newest map. It belongs to the family willing to care for it when nobody is watching. My grandfather, Walter Walker, used to tell me that every fence line, every creek, and every stretch of gravel carried a memory if you paid close enough attention. As a kid, I thought he was talking about stories. Years later, I realized he was talking about responsibility. Our ranch sits on 1,600 acres of rolling Texas pasture about an hour outside Austin. The land is not glamorous. There are no luxury resorts or fancy clubhouses, only open fields, limestone ridges, scattered oak trees, and cattle grazing beneath an endless sky. Every morning begins with the same familiar sounds. Wind brushing through cedar branches, the distant rumble of a diesel truck. Warming up, the soft creak of old wooden fence posts settling as the sun rises. Those sounds have been part of my life for as long as I can remember. My father taught me how to repair fences before I was tall enough to swing a post driver correctly. My grandfather taught me how to read survey markers hidden beneath tall grass and why every boundary stone mattered. He always carried folded property maps inside the glove compartment of his pickup, wrapped carefully in a weatherproof envelope like family photographs. He believed paperwork deserved the same respect as the land itself because one protected the other. The paved road everyone fought over later was never intended to become famous. It started as a simple necessity. Decades ago, my grandfather paid local contractors to replace an old gravel trail that became nearly impossible to use after heavy Texas storms. He supervised every stage himself, checking measurements with a tape measure instead of trusting guesses. My father often laughed about how Grandpa counted every load of crushed limestone delivered to the ranch because he wanted to know exactly where every dollar had gone. When the paving was finally finished, the road stretched from the county highway straight through our front gate and into the heart of the ranch. It was built entirely with family money, maintained entirely by family effort, and recorded entirely as private property. Every few years we sealed cracks after scorching summers, cleared fallen branches after thunderstorms, and repaired shoulders washed away by flash floods. No government crews ever arrived. No neighborhood association ever offered to help. Every invoice came to our mailbox, and every repair became another quiet reminder that ownership means showing up long after everyone else has gone home. Then the area around us slowly changed. Ranches disappeared one by one, replaced by carefully planned neighborhoods with matching mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, and perfectly trimmed lawns. Families moved into beautiful homes built where cattle once grazed. I never blamed them for wanting a peaceful place to live. Most waved when they drove past my gate. Some stopped to ask about the horses or compliment the sunset over the hills. They saw a welcoming entrance road every day and naturally assumed it belonged to the community beyond it. Few people ever stopped to wonder who had actually built it or why a private ranch road had quietly become the front door to an entire subdivision. That simple assumption would eventually grow into the biggest legal battle my family had ever faced. The first time I met Margaret Collins, she smiled the way experienced real estate agents often do, warm enough to make you lower your guard, but careful enough to reveal almost nothing about what they were actually thinking. She had recently become president of the Stone Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and she introduced herself as someone who simply wanted to build a stronger community. Standing beside the freshly landscaped neighborhood entrance, she complimented my ranch, admired the view across the hills, and asked how long my family had owned the property. Then her attention quietly shifted toward the road. She asked who maintained it, whether the county ever inspected it, and if I had considered allowing additional improvements near the entrance. At the time, her questions sounded like harmless curiosity. Looking back, I realized she had been studying the most valuable part of my property before I even understood there was a reason to be cautious. Over the next 2 years, Stone Creek Estates expanded quickly. New homes appeared where open pasture had once stretched toward the horizon. Decorative stone walls framed the subdivision entrance. Fresh flower beds lined both sides of the pavement. Elegant streetlights illuminated the first section of the road every evening, creating the impression that the entrance had always belonged to the neighborhood. Visitors admired the landscaping without realizing every improvement stopped exactly at my property line. Margaret understood something powerful. If enough people saw the same image every day, they eventually accepted it as fact without ever checking who actually owned the ground beneath it. Small changes continued appearing one after another. Directional signs pointed toward neighborhood amenities. Delivery drivers received maps showing the entrance as the primary route into the subdivision. Real estate advertisements proudly displayed photographs of the beautifully maintained approach leading towards Stone Creek Estates. None of those brochures mentioned that the road itself remained privately owned. The illusion grew stronger every month. Eventually, the association began acting as though appearances carried the same legal weight as recorded deeds. The first official letter arrived in a thick white envelope with the association logo embossed across the top. According to Margaret, the aging cedar fence along my entrance road no longer reflected the architectural standards of the surrounding community. She politely suggested replacing it with decorative iron fencing to create a more consistent appearance for homeowners and visitors. I called her that afternoon, assuming the letter had been sent by mistake. Instead, she calmly explained that attractive entrances benefited everyone. I thanked her for the suggestion and reminded her that my ranch was never included in the homeowners association. There was a brief silence before she answered in an almost cheerful voice. "Mr. Walker, neighborhoods evolve. Property owners have to evolve with them." That sentence stayed with me because it revealed far more than the letter itself. The requests gradually became more ambitious. The association questioned where my ranch equipment was parked near the entrance. They complained about feed trucks arriving during busy commuting hours. They even suggested placing community welcome banners near the front gate because they believed visitors expected a unified neighborhood appearance. Every proposal rested on the same quiet assumption. The road existed primarily to serve Stone Creek Estates instead of the ranch that had built it decades earlier. One afternoon, I watched Margaret walking the entrance with a commercial developer while they studied aerial maps spread across the hood of a luxury sport utility vehicle. I heard the developer mention future expansion beyond the existing subdivision, and Margaret pointed directly toward my road before saying, "Access has already been solved." She spoke with complete confidence, as though ownership were nothing more than a detail waiting for paperwork to catch up. At that moment, I realized she was no longer managing a neighborhood. She was planning around property she believed would eventually become hers to control. The certified envelope arrived on an unusually hot Thursday afternoon, tucked between my property tax statement and a feed supply invoice. I still remember the rough feel of the thick paper against my fingertips and the faint scent of fresh printer ink drifting out as I unfolded the first page beneath the shade of the porch. Stone Creek Estates Homeowners Association had officially filed suit. They were asking the district court to recognize a permanent legal right for the neighborhood to use my private entrance road forever. I read the first page twice because I honestly thought I had misunderstood what they were requesting. They were no longer asking permission to use the road. They were asking a judge to remove my family's exclusive control over the most important piece of access on the entire ranch. Their argument sounded surprisingly simple. Hundreds of families had depended on the road for years. Emergency vehicles regularly used the entrance. Delivery trucks relied on it every day. Closing the road in the future, they argued, would create unnecessary hardship for an established community. The documents never mentioned who had built the road, who had paid for every repair, or who had continued maintaining it through decades of storms and scorching Texas summers. Convenience had quietly replaced ownership in their version of the story. I drove to Austin the following morning to meet with a land use attorney named Daniel Pierce. His office overlooked the Colorado River, and every wall was covered with framed survey maps instead of expensive artwork. He spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every deed, tax receipt, maintenance invoice, and county survey I brought with me. Finally, he closed the last folder and leaned back in his chair. "This is not really a lawsuit about access," he said calmly. "It is a lawsuit about control. If they establish permanent rights over this road, every future decision involving your entrance becomes more complicated." Those words stayed with me during the months that followed. The legal process moved slowly, one hearing after another. Surveyors walked my property with measuring equipment. Engineers reviewed construction records. Attorneys exchanged boxes filled with maps, photographs, maintenance logs, and legal briefs thick enough to fill an entire pickup bed. Outside the courthouse, television reporters described the dispute as one ranch owner standing in the way of neighborhood progress. Online comments appeared every week from people who had never stepped onto my land, but somehow believed they understood its history better than my own family. Margaret embraced every opportunity to shape public opinion. During association meetings, she described the lawsuit as a fight for fairness and community stability. She spoke confidently about protecting homeowners while carefully avoiding one inconvenient fact. Nobody had ever been denied access to the road before the lawsuit began. My family had quietly maintained it for decades without asking anyone else to contribute a single dollar. Yet somehow the willingness to share had been transformed into evidence that sharing should become permanent. After one particularly difficult hearing, Daniel admitted something I already suspected. The property records strongly supported my ownership, but ownership alone might not answer every legal question the court wanted resolved. We needed something stronger than assumptions, stronger than memories, stronger than testimony. We needed proof explaining exactly why my grandfather built the road and under what conditions others were ever allowed to use it. As I drove home beneath a sky glowing orange with the Texas sunset, the familiar road stretched ahead of me exactly as it always had. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether somewhere on this ranch my grandfather had left behind one final lesson that neither Margaret nor I had discovered yet. I have always believed that paperwork has a strange kind of patience. It never argues, never raises its voice, and never cares who tells the better story. It simply waits until the right person opens the right page. Unfortunately, during the first several months of the lawsuit, we had not found that page yet. Every hearing seemed to end the same way. Margaret's attorneys walked into the courtroom carrying polished presentation boards, aerial photographs, traffic studies, and carefully prepared charts showing how hundreds of families relied on the entrance road every single day. They spoke about neighborhood growth, emergency response times, property values, and community expectations. Daniel responded with deeds, tax records, maintenance receipts, and county surveys proving my ownership, but each hearing circled back to the same uncomfortable question. Had decades of uninterrupted use created legal rights beyond simple ownership? Sitting quietly inside the courtroom while attorneys debated that question felt strangely unreal. Through the courthouse windows, I could see people walking downtown carrying coffee cups and shopping bags as though it were an ordinary afternoon, while inside that room my family's future was being discussed one legal argument at a time. After one particularly difficult hearing, Daniel gathered our documents into his worn leather briefcase and admitted what neither of us wanted to hear. The law strongly supported my ownership, but judges preferred evidence that removed every possible doubt. Somewhere there had to be a document explaining exactly why my grandfather built the road and under what conditions other properties had ever been allowed to use it. Without that missing piece, Margaret continued building a convincing narrative that long-term convenience had somehow transformed private property into permanent community infrastructure. She looked more confident after every court appearance. Stone Creek newsletters praised the association for protecting homeowners. Local interviews described the lawsuit as an important fight for neighborhood stability. Reading those stories became almost surreal because they never mentioned the countless weekends my father and I spent repairing washouts after heavy rain or sealing cracks under the blazing Texas sun. Every dollar spent maintaining that road came from our family. Every hour of labor belonged to us. Yet those years of quiet responsibility were slowly being rewritten into proof that the road existed primarily for someone else's benefit. One evening, exhausted from another disappointing hearing, I drove slowly back across the ranch instead of heading straight to the house. The setting sun painted the pastures in deep shades of gold, and the familiar smell of warm cedar drifted through the open truck window. I eventually stopped beside my grandfather's old equipment barn, a weathered building that had survived more storms than I could count. The wooden doors groaned as I pulled them open, releasing the scent of aged timber, machine oil, and decades of stored memories. I was not searching for hidden evidence. Honestly, I only wanted a few quiet minutes away from lawyers, reporters, and court filings. As I wandered deeper into the barn, my flashlight swept across rusted ranch tools, faded survey stakes, and shelves lined with dusty boxes that had not been touched since my grandfather passed away. Then the beam stopped on an old gray steel filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of wooden fence posts. I stared at it for a long moment, suddenly remembering how fiercely my grandfather protected every receipt, map, and handwritten note he ever created. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, I walked across the concrete floor, reached for the cold metal handle, and slowly pulled open the top drawer. I pulled the first drawer open expecting to find nothing more than faded utility bills and old receipts, and that was exactly what I found. The second drawer held yellowed insurance policies, tractor manuals, handwritten maintenance logs, and photographs of my grandfather standing beside the road while crews poured fresh asphalt decades earlier. Dust covered everything, and every folder smelled of old paper mixed with cedar and machine oil that had settled into the barn over the years. I almost pushed the cabinet shut and walked back to the house. Then I noticed the bottom drawer would not open more than a few inches. Something inside had shifted. After moving the heavy cabinet away from the wall, I reached behind it and felt a thick object wedged against the back panel. A worn leather binder slid onto the concrete floor with a dull sound that echoed through the empty barn. Across the faded cover, written neatly in my grandfather's handwriting, were 4 simple words: Private Access Road File. My heartbeat quickened before I even opened it. Inside were carefully organized engineering drawings showing the original construction of the entrance road from the county highway to our ranch headquarters. Every page carried survey stamps, measurements, handwritten notes, and correspondence dating back more than 40 years. Folded between the maps were letters exchanged between my grandfather and the attorney who had handled the original construction project. I sat down on an old wooden stool beneath the warm evening light pouring through the barn windows and began reading every page from beginning to end. The further I read, the clearer everything became. My grandfather had anticipated that neighboring ranches might eventually be developed into residential communities. Because of that possibility, he instructed his attorney to prepare a carefully limited access agreement instead of granting permanent rights. The agreement allowed neighboring agricultural properties to use the entrance under specific conditions while preserving complete ownership of the road. Then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. The language was remarkably direct. Any temporary access granted to neighboring land would automatically terminate if that surrounding property was converted from agricultural use into residential subdivision unless a completely new written agreement was voluntarily signed by the owner of the road. I read those lines several times, making certain I understood every word correctly. Stone Creek Estates had transformed thousands of acres of former ranch land into residential neighborhoods years earlier. No replacement agreement had ever been signed by my family. The permission everyone believed still existed had quietly expired the moment the land changed its legal use. The road had never become community property. It had simply continued being used because nobody realized the original conditions had already ended. Before sunrise the next morning, Daniel drove out to the ranch carrying his laptop and several empty document boxes. We spread every page from the leather binder across my grandfather's old workbench, while fresh coffee filled the barn with its rich aroma. Daniel compared the original surveys with modern county records, verified recording numbers, and matched signatures against archived courthouse documents. Nearly 2 hours passed before he finally leaned back, removed his reading glasses, and smiled for the first time since the lawsuit began. He tapped the access agreement with one finger and quietly said, "This is the document we have been searching for." Every assumption Margaret had built her case upon depended on the belief that continuous use created permanent rights. This binder proved something entirely different. Continuous use had only existed because my grandfather generously allowed it under conditions that no longer existed. History had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting inside a forgotten filing cabinet for someone patient enough to read every page before reaching the final sentence. I did exactly what Daniel told me to do after we finished organizing every document inside the binder. I stayed quiet. There was no reason to celebrate, no reason to argue online, and certainly no reason to let Margaret know what we had found. Strong evidence loses its advantage when the other side has weeks to prepare an explanation. Instead, we spent the following days making sure every page could withstand the closest legal examination. Daniel contacted the county clerk to obtain certified copies of the original recordings. Survey numbers were matched against modern parcel maps. Signatures were verified. Even the faded construction invoices were traced back to archived tax filings and contractor records. Watching him work reminded me of my grandfather repairing a fence. Every loose board mattered because one weak section could eventually bring down the entire line. While the legal team focused on documents, I quietly turned my attention back to the ranch. The old steel entrance gate had remained open almost every day for years because there had never been a reason to close it. I called the same welding company that had serviced it several summers earlier and asked them to inspect every hinge, support post, and hydraulic arm. The foreman looked surprised when he realized I wanted the entire system restored to perfect working order. He asked if I was expecting heavy traffic. I smiled and told him I simply believed equipment should always be ready before it became necessary. Over the next several days, the gate was cleaned, reinforced, and tested until it opened and closed smoothly without a single vibration. At the same time, I hired a local security company to replace the aging cameras overlooking the entrance. New high-resolution cameras were installed on sturdy poles near the gate, each carefully positioned to record the roadway from multiple angles while blending naturally into the ranch landscape. The technician demonstrated how every recording would automatically back up to secure cloud storage. He asked whether there had been recent problems with trespassing. I answered honestly, not yet. The final preparation seemed almost insignificant compared with everything else. I ordered a professionally manufactured aluminum sign with reflective lettering instead of the faded wooden marker that had weathered decades beneath the Texas sun. The wording was simple and impossible to misunderstand. Private road. Authorized access only. I leaned the finished sign against the wall inside the equipment barn and left it there. It would remain hidden until the court finished speaking. Throughout those same weeks, Margaret appeared more confident than ever. The association continued discussing future neighborhood expansion, and promotional materials proudly highlighted the convenient paved entrance serving Stone Creek Estates. During one planning session, minutes later entered into the public record described the road as permanent neighborhood infrastructure. Reading those words almost made me laugh because permanence only exists when the owner agrees to it, and nobody in my family had ever granted permanent rights. The final hearing approached quietly. Early that morning, I drove toward the courthouse beneath a pale blue Texas sky while cool air drifted through the open truck window, carrying the familiar scent of cedar and fresh-cut grass. Daniel sat beside me with my grandfather's leather binder resting securely inside a weathered briefcase between us. Neither of us said very much during the drive because every important conversation had already happened. Margaret arrived surrounded by board members, consultants, and attorneys carrying polished presentation binders filled with charts and photographs. She smiled confidently as reporters gathered outside the courthouse steps, completely convinced that months of preparation had positioned the association for victory. She had no idea the strongest evidence in the entire case was not displayed on presentation boards or projected onto courtroom screens. It rested quietly inside a worn leather binder that had spent decades waiting inside an old ranch barn for the exact morning when history would finally matter more than assumption. I have replayed that final hearing in my mind more times than I can count, and what I remember most is not a dramatic speech or a heated argument. It was the silence that settled over the courtroom when the documents finally began speaking for themselves. Margaret's attorneys opened exactly as everyone expected. Large aerial photographs filled the courtroom screens, traffic studies illustrated daily vehicle counts, and polished presentations emphasized how deeply the neighborhood depended on the entrance road. They described community expectations, emergency response, and years of uninterrupted access as though repetition alone could transform private ownership into public entitlement. When their presentation ended, Daniel stood slowly, carried my grandfather's weathered leather binder to the evidence table, and asked permission to submit several newly authenticated documents into the record. The judge nodded, and one by one the original construction plans, certified surveys, recorded agreements, contractor invoices, and archive correspondence were handed forward. There was nothing flashy about any of it. Yellowed paper replaced colorful presentation. Boards, handwritten notes replaced polished graphics. Yet every page fit perfectly with the next until the history of the road became impossible to misunderstand. Daniel directed the court's attention to the original access agreement my grandfather had recorded decades earlier. The judge spent several quiet minutes reading the language himself before asking both attorneys to approach the bench. I watched Margaret lean toward her legal team as they carefully reviewed the same paragraph again and again. Their confidence slowly faded into confusion. The wording could not have been clearer. Temporary access existed only while the neighboring land remained agricultural unless a completely new written agreement was voluntarily signed by the owner. Stone Creek Estates had converted that neighboring property into residential development years earlier. No replacement agreement had ever existed. No amendment had ever been recorded. No transfer of ownership had ever taken place. The judge returned to the bench and asked a series of simple questions. Did the association possess any signed agreement replacing the original conditions? No. Had any member of my family ever conveyed ownership of the road? No. Did continuous use alone erase recorded property rights? Again, no evidence supported that conclusion. The courtroom became remarkably quiet because every answer pointed toward the same unavoidable conclusion. The entrance road remained exactly what it had always been, privately owned property. Late that afternoon, the ruling was announced. The court denied the association's claims, confirmed my ownership, and recognized that the original conditional permission had already expired under its own recorded terms years earlier. As we walked out of the courthouse, Daniel quietly reminded me that ownership carries responsibility as well as rights. The next morning, I honored both. Before sunrise, the welding crew completed the final inspection of the restored gate. The new reflective sign was secured beside the entrance, and the upgraded security cameras quietly began recording. Shortly after dawn, the first commuters approached expecting another ordinary weekday. Instead, brake lights stretched across the entrance as drivers slowed before the closed gate. Some stepped from their vehicles to read the sign. Others searched the hills for another paved entrance that simply did not exist. Margaret arrived a few minutes later carrying the same folder she had carried through every hearing. She spoke respectfully with the deputy assigned to monitor traffic, but nothing changed because nothing needed to change. The court had not taken the road away from anyone that morning. It had merely confirmed what every deed, survey, invoice, and forgotten document had quietly declared for decades. The road had never stopped belonging to my family. For the first time in years, everyone else simply had to recognize it. The gate remained closed for 3 days, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because the court had restored the legal reality that had existed long before Stone Creek Estates was ever built. During those quiet mornings, I stood on my porch with a fresh cup of black coffee, watching sunlight spread across the same rolling pasture my grandfather had once crossed on horseback. The air smelled of cedar, damp grass, and warm earth after an overnight shower, while meadowlarks perched along weathered fence posts as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Out on the ranch, life continued exactly as it always had. Cattle wandered peacefully through the fields. Ranch trucks followed familiar dirt trails, and the entrance road lay silent beneath the golden light. It was remarkable how quickly the land returned to normal once the arguments disappeared. On the fourth morning, a single white sport utility vehicle approached the closed gate instead of the usual line of impatient commuters. Margaret stepped out alone, without television cameras, without consultants, and without the confidence that had followed her into every courtroom hearing. She waited quietly until I drove down from the house. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds came from wind moving through the oak trees and distant cattle grazing beyond the fence line. Finally, she admitted that the association needed a permanent legal solution instead of another legal battle. There was no anger left in her voice, only the calm acceptance that comes after every argument has already been answered. Later that afternoon, Daniel joined us beneath the same old oak tree where my grandfather used to park his pickup after repairing fences. Together, we reviewed a completely different set of documents from the ones that had filled the courtroom. This time, the language was straightforward. The association would purchase a properly recorded access easement at fair market value. The homeowners association would accept full responsibility for maintaining the entrance corridor within the agreed boundaries. My family would retain ownership of the road itself and every acre surrounding it. Every right would be clearly defined. Every responsibility would be written into the public record. Every future property owner would understand exactly where private ownership ended and authorized access began. Several weeks later, county surveyors returned to verify the new easement boundaries against both the original surveys and the newly recorded agreement. Fresh boundary markers were installed with careful precision, and updated county records reflected exactly what should have existed from the beginning. The entrance reopened under lawful terms. Families resumed their daily routines, school buses returned to their normal schedules, and delivery drivers once again followed the familiar pavement into the neighborhood. The difference was that convenience no longer replaced ownership. Everyone now understood that access existed because it had been legally negotiated instead of simply assumed. Every now and then I still drive slowly along that stretch of road just before sunset. The steel gate opens smoothly, the cameras quietly watch over the entrance, and the reflective sign stands exactly where it belongs. Sometimes I stop beside the old equipment barn and think about my grandfather carefully placing that leather binder inside a forgotten filing cabinet decades earlier. He never met Margaret Collins. He never saw Stone Creek Estates. Yet somehow he understood that the greatest protection a family could leave behind was not a stronger fence or a heavier gate. It was clear paperwork preserved with patience and respect. I learned that justice rarely arrives with loud celebrations or dramatic victories. More often it arrives through ordinary people who take the time to read every page, protect every promise, And remember that true ownership is not measured by who uses the land the most, but by who accepts the lifelong responsibility of caring for it.